Hi guys, today's lesson is aimed at National 5 Fashion Textile students, and today's focus is going to be on seams. We're going to cover a few different types of seams for you, but basically you need to know what a seam is. A seam is the stitch line joining two pieces of fabric together. Okay, let's get started. Right guys, so to start off with, we're going to work with the most common seam that you will be using, and that is the straight seam or the open seam as it's often called as well. This is simply just joining the two pieces of fabric together with a straight stitch down the edge here. So to start off with, I've lined my fabrics up as straight as possible, and I'm going to cross pin about 3 finger widths apart, okay, joining these sections of fabric together. Now the reason we cross pin, as I've explained in a previous video, is so that the needle can hop over these pins without breaking. Okay, so now I've pinned it, I'm now going to take that to the sewing machine. Now when we talk about a seam allowance, that is the amount of fabric that's left over from your stitch line. Okay, so I'm going to set my fabric up at the 1 centimetre gauge here, so that when my needle is dropped down into the fabric, I'm left with a 1 centimetre seam allowance. Starting as always with a few stitches forward and then a few back to secure the threads, so that's my reverse stitch. And now I'm just going to continue trying to keep this as straight as possible all the way down. And you can see there that my needle just hops right over the pins. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stop short. So you can see here what I'm doing is I'm using the balance wheel to control my stitches, so I'm stopping exactly where I want. I'm going to leave the needle in. I'm going to demonstrate turning a corner at this point for you because this is something that you're going to find useful too. Okay, so I've left my needle in. I'm going to raise my lever, my press foot lever there, and pivot my fabric round at a 90-degree angle. You can see it's not moving anywhere off that axis because the needle is holding it, and now I can drop the presser foot back down again and continue my row of stitching. So I've not broken the line of stitching, there's no weakness in that, and I have a nice sharp right angled corner on my fabric. I'm going to cut my fabric, my thread at the beginning and end. And what I've demonstrated to you there is a straight seam with a corner. But I'm going to do a video later on different types of finishing. Today I'm just focusing on your seams. Okay, if you were dressmaking, you may also wish to press your seams open, hence why this is called an open seam. Okay, so it would sit like that. But I want to show you something with a corner later on, so I've put a wee corner in for you. Okay guys, so as we're talking about open and straight seams, I thought I'm as well telling you a little bit about sewing on a curved edge as well, because there will be times that you need to sew on a curved line. No body is completely angular, okay, we've all got curves in places. So fabric works very differently when you're cutting and sewing on a curve. You can see here with a straight stitch, with a straight weave of fabric, there is no movement in that. That is completely rigid on that woven fabric there. Now this is the same fabric, but I've cut it across the grain. Okay, so at some points this is what we call bias cut, because it's cutting at a 45-degree angle to the grain of the fabric. Okay, so what that means is the fabric is now, it allows it to stretch ever so slightly. So it's really crucial that you pin as you go with a curved fabric like that, okay? So what I'm going to show you now is how to stitch that. So again, same principle applies with lining it up with your centimetre seam allowance, placing the foot down and the needle in to secure the fabric. What you must be very careful of now though is pulling the fabric. There should be no resistance and pulling at the fabric with your fingertips. What you're actually doing is the opposite. You're actually feeding it round ever so slightly. So again, I'm going to start with my few stitches of reverse stitch, and then pretty much anchoring here and feeding it from here so it's going round in the corner. And that should retain the shape and size of your circle. That becomes important if you're doing something like a sleeve which has a corner in it. You don't want to overstretch your sleeve so it doesn't fit into your shoulder. You can see how I'm lifting the presser foot to help ease that under as well. You are in control of the machine at all times. If you see that the fabric's not doing what you want to do, then take control of it and do what you need to. Either lift the presser foot or use the balance wheel. They're all there. They're all tools for you to use to help you. Okay, I'm now going to take that out and cut my threads. Now, the reason I want to show you this as well, not only for your handle on the fabric, but also how we present this the right side around. What you can see here is the seam allowance. We've got a 1 centimetre seam allowance and our stitch line, but you wouldn't see that as you were wearing it. Okay, these seams would be on the inside. So what happens if I turn this the right way around? As you can see, it's quite bulky. You can feel the seam in there. So I'm going to trim this excess down. So you would be expected to trim as well to ease that fullness. Okay, and now as I turn that through, you can see that that's going to sit a lot neater, a lot flatter there. Alright guys, so I also thought I would show you how to sew around a curved edge here as well. This is the sort of thing that can be a bit problematic, especially when maybe you're making a top and you've got an underarm curve that you need to stitch. As you cut a curved line in your fabric, it can start to stretch and bow because we don't have that rigid fibres of the weave holding it in place. Okay, so I've pinned it as I've gone there, and I'm now going to stitch again my centimetre seam allowance. Starting with my reverse stitch. And carefully easing it through. I don't want to pull or stretch my fabric at any point here. And cut my threads. Now the reason I've shown you this is if you were to make let's say a top, and this is your underarm seam. We don't want to see these seams. These are going to be on the inside of your top. So what we would need to do would be to turn it through like this. But you can see that doesn't want to sit right. And the reason for that is that if we were to measure this circumference here, it is actually a lot smaller than this circumference here. So it's pulling at the fabric. So what we need to do is we need to release this curved edge so it turns through easily. Okay, so I'm going to take my scissors and snip evenly up to the stitch line, but not across the stitch line. We don't want to break the stitches. Okay, and that means that when we turn this through now, you can already see that these are starting to stretch open. And I've now got a nice smooth curve. So, important lesson for curved edges like that is to snip your seam allowance. If I just lift it up again, you can see just how much they've spread there. Okay? So we've got a straight stitch for an open seam, we've got an open seam there on a curved edge with the clipped seam. Alright, the next thing I'm going to show you is a French seam. Okay, so a French seam is used for fabrics that would fray and that you don't want any finishing stitches on the outside. Usually used for something like organza, lightweight fabrics that you might see the stitching through the fabric. It might be a sheer fabric, so you want a nice finish on both the outside and the inside. So I'm going to show you that on this piece of cotton here. First thing you're going to do is I'm going to take a larger seam allowance just to show you how this is going to work. I'm going to take a 1.5 seam allowance this time. Okay, and then I'm going to again secure it. Remove my stitches. And then what I want to do is to press this seam open ever so slightly. Okay, so I'm going to just for ease here, I'm going to use my finger. This is quite a stiff cotton, so it's going to sit and behave as I want it to. You might need to use an ironing board if you don't have a cotton. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to reduce this seam allowance down by half. So this is now going to be 1.75 of a seam. Left. Okay, so I can now remove that. The reason I'm doing that is, again, just make sure that this is pressed open. I'm now going to fold my fabric over this way. So I can now see my stitches. They should be right on the very edge. That's why I've used a black thread for you today, so you can see that a bit easier. Okay, and I'm now going to take that back to the sewing machine, and this time stitch at 1 centimetre seam allowance. And because I've cut off so much of the seam on the inside, when I turn this through, there should be no frayed edges, nothing visible there, so that looks like the normal seam on the outside of your garment. Okay, and on the inside of your garment you would have a nicely finished, no overlocking stitches, no zigzag stitches, just a smooth finish to your fabric. Alright, that is a French seam. If you're practicing this at home, I suggest you practice using a plain fabric to begin with, because when you start to work with the right sides and the wrong sides, then you need to start thinking, well, which sides am I putting together first? Okay, if you are working with a pattern fabric, you're going to be putting your fabric wrong side to wrong side, so you'd be looking at the right side of the fabric as you stitch these together. Trim down your threads, trim down your seam allowance, and then reverse it over so that you're creating your seam on the right side. Okay. Alright guys, so the final seam I'm going to show you today is a felled seam. This seam you'll find used in jeans, that sort of thing. It's also used if you're wearing reversible clothes, so that it looks flat and finished on both sides of the fabric. Okay, so again, 2 pieces of fabric pinned together. I'll just pin these very quickly. And I'm going to take my centimetre seam allowance again. I tend to take a centimetre seam allowance as standard, but when you are working with commercial patterns, you will probably find that most of them use a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. So always check that when you come to sew. If you were to take a larger seam allowance than is specified, then your garment or item is going to end up a little smaller than you would expect. Okay, so that's my first stitch line for my fell seam. What I need to do now is cut down one side. Again, you might find this easier if you take this to the ironing board and press it. But I'm going to cut down just one side of this seam allowance to no more than 5 mils. So a little bit fiddly with this one. So now you can see I've got one edge a lot longer than the other. I will press this at the ironing board, and then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tuck in a small amount underneath here and pin as I go. I want this to look nice and straight. You'll find a lot of your time when you're sewing is spent on preparation and actually not so much at the sewing machine. Okay, if you're struggling to keep this straight, then I would suggest using a ruler or a measuring tape just to make sure that you've got this straight, because it will be a bit of an eyesore if you're stitching and your fabric is a bit wobbly. Also, if you want to work with a larger seam allowance to start off with, that's fine. I've given myself a bit of a challenge here by starting with such a small seam allowance. Okay, and now all I want to do is stitch down this row of this edge of my seam here. So what I've done here is I've lined up the edge of my fold with this part of my foot. There's lots of different gauges that you could use on your foot, so either if you're wanting to set it up at the side of the foot or at the metal toe on the inside or at the outside of the curve. So you find where is a good position for you, and that's where you train your eye and keep the fabric in line with that. So you can see I'm going a little bit slower with this one. I'm taking my time because it is a bit fiddlier. Reverse stitch, lift my needle out, and that is your felled seam. As I say, you would use this on reversible clothing or items, and you'll find that generally on your jeans, like so. Okay, so today we've covered your straight stitch. I've shown you how to do a corner. I've shown you how to sew around a curved edge and clip the seam. I've shown you a French seam, and I've now shown you a felled seam. But I want to take you back to the straight stitch where I did the corner, okay? Because as we turn this through, there's a few things that you need to be able to do as well. So first of all, again, we've got a corner here, so I would, anything that you sew, all of your seam allowance, you need to consider your seam allowance on the inside of the garment. How is that seam allowance going to behave? So if I was to turn this corner through, now ideally I like a nice neat corner, so I would fold, if nothing else, fold my edges in so I can pop out a nice sharp corner here. But that still leaves it quite bulky, so actually what I would suggest over that is to clip the corners and remove any excess fabric there. I've not cut the threads, I've not reduced down my seam allowance, I've merely cut off the corner piece so that when I come to fold this through, I can still retain my nice sharp edge. You could use your finger, you could use the point of your scissors if it's not too sharp, or you can tease out very carefully using a pin your point so you have a nice sharp corner on your fabric. Alright guys, so we've covered seams today. I've shown you 3 different versions of seams: the straight or open seam, the French seam, and the felled seam, all of which have different purposes. So if you have a sewing machine at home, then have a go at some of these techniques. If not, then you should be taking the notes down on what each seam is, even if you give yourself a little diagram to help to go back to. Okay, thanks very much guys. Leave any feedback, comments, and like and subscribe. See you soon, bye.